Hey, welcome back. Jack here in the DevSlope Southern Command Center. And today we're going to be talking about this and bind. Now, we talked about this back when we talked about objects. This can actually lose its context, and I'm going to show you how to resolve that problem. This is going to be a quick lesson here, but we're going to cover a few things real quick. So if you'll remember in JavaScript, the thing called this is the object that owns the JavaScript code. So let's look at some examples here. Let's create a new object called Hot Rod. So this is just a new empty object called Hot Rod. So now let's go ahead and say Hot Rod equals, and let's assign some properties here. So we'll say the sound it makes is vroom. And then we'll also give it a function called sound off. And then when we call that function, we'll just say console.log this.sound. Alright. Now then, if we just say hot rod dot sound off and save it, well, it helps if I do the right object here. Okay, so we assign the property sound to hot rod and the function sound off. And if I save it, you see here we get vroom. Now then, what if we do something like this? What if we assign that function to a variable? Well, if we call it and save it, you see here we get undefined. Well, what happens is when we assign this function to another variable, it's outside of this object. So this loses its context here. All right, so there's a way around this. Okay, so we can bind this to the object hot rod, and this will give sound function a this context. And the way we do that is we can say let bound sound function, and I'm just giving it a name here so we know what it is. Bound sound function equal sound function dot bind, and then pass in the object hot rod. So we got our sound function here, the variable that we assigned to this function. And we pass in, or we call bind on it and pass in the hot rod object. So now if we do bound sound function and save it, you see now we have our context back. So we've got our this context back because we bound that to the hot rod object. Alright, so let's look at some more examples here. So let's say let person1 equals, and this is going to be an object. We'll just say name Joe, and we'll say let person2 equal name Jane. All right, and then we say function log name, and we'll just say return this dot name. Well, this has no context. It's not part of an object. So we can bind this, or we can bind or we can bind this function to an object. Now first, let's just look at console.log, and then we'll just say log name. If I save it, you'll see here we get undefined. So now if we do something like this, console.log, log name, dot bind, and then the person we want to bind it to, and actually we've got to call it, since we're doing it all in one line here. If I save it, you see we bound it to person 1, which is Joe. So now this dot name has a context and it's Joe. We can do the same thing and now it's bound to Jane. So we bound it here to person 1, which is Joe, and then we bound it here to person 2, which is Jane, and we got our this context back. Alright, so let's look at another example. So we could say let number equal, and then we'll say x is 24, y is 22. So this is a number object with an x and a y property. So then we can say let count equal function console.log this.x plus this.y. Well, there's no this context here. So the way we can resolve this is we could say let bound count equal count.bind, and we can bind that to number. Now we can call bound count, save it, and you see we get 46, which is our function here, this.x plus this.y. If we try to do that here, by just calling count, you see here we get not a number. Well, it doesn't have context here. So we bound it to the number object, and we've got our values, and when we call it, we get the result we expect. So that's just a brief overview of bind, of this and bind, and we're going to go ahead and move on. Don't get too wrapped up into this. We'll point it out where we need to, if we need to go into it a little deeper later on in the course.